All right. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and welcome to the role of resolutions in Mennonite Church USA. That will be our topic for today. Let's just open up in a word of prayer. Dear God, we just thank you for bringing us together today as your children, as the body of Christ. God, we come to learn more about the workings of Mennonite Church USA, our process for speaking out on various issues and organizing how we do business. God, I pray that you will be with us, lead us and guide us as we learn together today. Bless those that are a part of our panel. And God, we ask your blessings upon Mennonite Church USA as we get ready for our special session of the Delegate Assembly. God, we pray for your wisdom. We pray that your spirit will guide us in all things. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel who will be sharing with us today. I'm joined by two very wonderful people. We have Bonita Croyle. Bonita is going to be part of our resolutions process, our resolutions committee. She's helping us think through some things. And so it's good to have some younger people participating in our process, people who serve in different roles in our system. We also have John Carlson, who's still young, as I think about age, but he's a pastor, and he also serves on the executive board, and he is the moderator elect for Mennonite Church USA. And so we're going to start off today with John. He's going to share a little bit about the history of resolutions in our system to get us started on this journey, and then we'll follow up with Bonita as she shares a little bit about the current resolutions we have in Mennonite Church USA. So, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And in my book, you're still pretty young too. So for whatever that's worth, we'll give you that for a couple more years yet, at least one or two, maybe. We'll see. We'll see. So yeah, I thought it would be good to reflect a little bit on how we've gotten here kind of historically. If you've ever done any work with Strengths Finder at all, for me, like my highest thing that comes up every time I take that test is history. Like that's where my fascination lies. Where we are now is a direct result of where we've been before. And if you grew up in the Mennonite church or have spent much time at all around Mennonites, then you probably have learned that Mennonites love to meet. I often am on Zoom calls and things like that, and my kids say, "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I have a meeting." And they say, "Well, what's your meeting about?" And I realize that an awful lot of the meetings I participate in are actually meetings to plan other meetings. Like we love meetings so much. And so we love to come together and hash through things and make decisions. And again, if you grew up around Mennonites, if you grew up in the Mennonite church, if you spent time around Mennonites, it's easy to start to take that for granted and just to assume that's the way all people throughout all history and all Christian traditions have done things. But in reality, it's not. There is something somewhat distinctive about Mennonite practice. And so it's worth thinking about sort of where that came from. And it does stretch back really, really far in the Christian tradition. So you see pretty early on a pattern established within Christian churches where representatives of different churches would come together and meet to try to make decisions, hash through things together. Probably the earliest example we have would be the story of the Jerusalem Council recorded in Acts 15, where people from different communities of Christian faith come together to think through and talk about the inclusion, welcome of Gentiles into the people of God. And then there are these other famous councils that meet in places like Nicaea and Constantinople and really help to define what we now think of as the essence of Christian belief, Christian faith. In the Mennonite tradition, well, before we get to the Mennonite tradition, maybe it's worth recognizing that even as the Christian church had this history and tradition for a long time, it started to change. Decision-making authority began to be more and more concentrated in the hands of a select group of people. A lot of that decision-making authority gets vested in the Pope in the Western Church and sometimes a council of cardinals, but it's not this broad and certainly not democratic decision-making process. Decision-making becomes very concentrated. So with the start of the Reformation, and particularly with what we think of as the Radical Reformation that the Anabaptist movement is typical of, what you start to see is that people have to figure out what is the basis for authority. How do we make decisions? How do we decide things? And there's this reemergence of this early Christian pattern, sort of the Jerusalem Council pattern, of people coming together from different faith communities, meeting together with a defined set of questions to address, and coming away with some sort of statement or confession. The earliest we find in in the late 1520s, the Schleitheim Confession. If you've grown up around Mennonites, maybe you're familiar with this language, but it's interesting to see how this Schleitheim Confession begins. It begins, these are the articles that we have addressed and in which we are united. And so it's not that they're coming together trying to decide every single matter of faith and practice, but they're coming together to decide a certain set of questions. And they come away with these 7 articles on which these different groups of Christians, meeting in different geographical areas, have come to consensus on. In these matters, we are united. And so this decision-making pattern, where authority really is primarily congregational, it's vested in the local congregation, but then the local congregation is in conversation and dialogue with other congregations around questions. This becomes pretty normative throughout different Anabaptist expressions. And so confessions or statements, later we'll use the language of resolutions, these become ways to express both unity, areas that we agree on, but also areas of disunity. So in the Russian Mennonite story, for example, in the 1860s, there's a letter drafted that says this group of Mennonite brethren are separating from this other group of Mennonites. And that actually becomes the founding document of the Mennonite Brethren Church. So here on this continent, you see in both of the streams or traditions that would come together to form Mennonite Church USA, both of these groups continue to practice this sort of thing, where they come together as groups representing different areas, different congregations. They come together and try to reach consensus. And so statements and resolutions serve a variety of functions in Mennonite traditions, especially in the 1900s and moving into the 2000s. They're a way to respond to controversies. So you see that there are resolutions passed pertaining to issues of the fundamentalist modernist controversies. They become ways to give guidance to churches in matters of faith and life. So there's a resolution passed by the Mennonite Church, or the Old Mennonite Church, in 1913 about dress. This became such a pressing question that groups met together at essentially the national level to issue guidance to local congregations about matters of dress. There are resolutions passed about recreation, about the call and care of pastors. These are sort of inward focused, reflecting on the life of congregations and the life of the denomination. Statements and resolutions also seek to speak to broader societal issues. So you can find in our history resolutions about nuclear power, about militarism, about television violence, about energy sources and environmentalism, racial concerns, about abortion. And just hearing this list, you can see how the resolutions process is very much sort of culturally embedded. It's reflective of what's going on in the culture at any given point in time. The church is seeking to speak or to bear witness to the broader culture based on the church's convictions. Resolutions and statements also work to structure the denomination. So we'll talk a little bit later about how resolutions function relative to congregations, area conferences, and the denomination. But resolutions are ways that the entire denomination comes to make a single decision. So even for the formation of Mennonite Church USA, and I'm sure some of you on this webinar lived through this experience, for that merger to become official, there had to be 2 different resolutions passed, one by each of the pre-existing bodies, General Conference and Old Mennonite Church. Each of their delegates had to pass or affirm resolutions in order for this merger to happen. So it's interesting as you look back on the history, one thing that we don't tend to do is we don't tend to retract resolutions. We tend to pass these resolutions and then sort of just move forward. And sometimes we pass new resolutions that say something different, sometimes profoundly different, sometimes only slightly different. But we rarely look back and evaluate the resolutions that we've passed. Instead, we pass a resolution in a particular moment in time. It speaks to local congregations, maybe area conferences, the denomination. Perhaps it speaks to broader society. And then we move forward. And then there's a new subject that comes up that we wrestle through and work through. So this is a very, very ancient practice within the Christian tradition that has this particularity within the Mennonite tradition. Because we place such a high value on community, on being together, on making decisions together, one of the ways that we try to do that is to define an agenda, to come together and test and see whether we have consensus. So that's been some of the history leading up. It's a very brief snapshot, sort of telling how we got here from the 1500s to where we are now. And I'm excited for some of the things Bonita's going to share with us about work that we've done in our much more recent past and specific resolutions that we've worked with in the past decade or so.
So John, before we segue to Bonita,
Yeah.
can you just say just really quickly when you say consensus, what do you mean? Because we have words, but I think we
Yes.
sometimes have different understandings.
Yeah, so one of the questions that was actually submitted in advance of this webinar that I think we'll talk about more in depth as we go along, that I think is just a wonderful question, is do congregations have to agree with the resolutions that are passed? And I think you could put an even finer point on that and say, do individual members of congregations have to agree with the resolutions that are passed? And I'm probably not going to be as concise in my answer, Glenn, as you would want me to be. I'm probably not going to be quite as definitive, but I will just highlight that there is this tension. So I didn't grow up Mennonite, right? Like I came into this tradition as an adult, and I'm sort of finding my way forward. And one of the things that I've recognized is that there's this tension inherent to some of our most closely cherished, closely held beliefs. On the one hand, we really highly value the role of individual conscience within the life of faith. Right? This is the essence of Anabaptism, that you should only join the church based on a voluntary personal decision, that it should be a personal choice of your own conscience to be baptized and commit to following Jesus. So there's this really high value placed on individual conscience. At the same time, there's an awful lot of conformist pressure. We value working together as a community, functioning together as a community, having shared values, shared ideals, a shared sense of mission and vision. So both of these things coexist in our tradition, a really high value of individual conscience and a high value on group cohesion or unity, or what we might call solidarity even. And some of the tension between those two is worked out in our resolutions process. We put forward a resolution and it seems like a majority of us agree, but there might be dissenting voices. So how do we respond to or respect those dissenting voices? So consensus, I will say, Glenn, consensus is not unanimity, right? Like we don't require that everyone agree on something in order for a resolution to be passed, nor do we present resolutions as litmus tests of faith or membership. At various points in Mennonite church history, we have established really clear what were called tests of membership. That's far less common today. Certainly, I'm not aware of many churches in Mennonite Church USA that have those sort of formal requirements. And so it's certainly possible to be an active participant in the life of a congregation or even an area conference, a denomination, while not agreeing entirely with all of the resolutions we've passed throughout our history. So consensus does not mean unanimity, but it does perhaps mean there's a shared sense that I hesitate to say majority, maybe a plurality of us. I don't know even what the best language to use is all the time, but to say many of us agree about these questions, maybe not on all the fine details, but we agree in concept that this is something that we believe together or a way that we want to live out our faith together.
All right, thank you so much. Bonita, we'll turn it over to you.
John and Glenn, thank you. And John, I will say your love of history just shines through as you're providing all of that background. That was incredible. Thank you so much for providing everyone with that. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. For the next 15 minutes or so, I will clarify the different types of resolutions and statements, as John mentioned, and then review various statements and resolutions that have passed to date. So what's the difference between a statement and a resolution anyway? It's a little tricky to understand, but here's what you need to know. Technically, every statement is a resolution, but not every resolution is a church statement. So how does that make sense? Well, here it is. We have three types of resolutions: simple resolutions, organizational resolutions, and church statements. Simple resolutions are generally resolutions that are expressed thanks to the hosting regional conference or approved minutes. Organizational resolutions are actions taken to approve bylaws or deal with other legal matters. And church statements are statements which receive broad support across the church and give direction for Christian faithfulness, often on current issue, and should be available for study and discussion in home communities and or conferences before delegates arrive at the assembly. Understanding the resolution process can be complicated. And we know that because we have a lot of you here who are interested in learning more about it. And writing resolutions can also be really complicated. Glenn's going to share his screen with y'all in a moment to show you where the statements and resolutions are linked on the MCUSA website. And I wanted to also draw your attention to the fact that while we have a list of statements and resolutions that have passed over the last few decades, you will notice that we don't have a list of statements and resolutions that have not passed. In a recent resolutions committee meeting, we noted that it's important to us to highlight the incredible amount of work, emotional labor, and time that each person and group of people put into drafting and revising the resolutions that get proposed. And we take this work seriously, and we know you do too. It's important to us that the work, time, and labor of those involved in the resolutions process, whether the resolution passes or not, is not erased. Tonight, as I review the resolutions, you will hear me note that some of these resolutions went through multiple revisions. Some of these resolutions like the Seeking Peace in Israel-Palestine of 2015 didn't pass the first time it was brought to the delegates. Instead, some resolutions were asked to be tabled for further revision and consideration. Again, time, effort, discernment, and so much emotional labor went into each step of the resolutions process. And if you're anything like me, I imagine for those of you who have gone through the resolutions process or writing one, it might have felt exhausting, intimidating, emotionally draining, tedious, frustrating, and sometimes infuriating. But it also might have felt encouraging, rewarding, inspiring, and perhaps a lot like community building. Tonight, in order for all of us to develop a shared historic understanding of where we have been and what resolutions we have passed, I will review the resolutions I have passed by reading a short summary of them. And I also wanted to highlight that 5 resolutions in particular, Seeking Peace in Israel-Palestine, Church Statement on Immigration, Protecting and Nurturing Our Children and Youth, Creation Care for Resolution, Mennonite Church USA, and the Resolution on Healthcare Access have had extensive engagement and participation across the denomination. So when did all of these resolutions begin? Let's start by going all the way back to the beginning in 2001. In 2001, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in early July in Nashville, Tennessee, and what I understand was preparation for the 2002 merger of General Conference Mennonite Church and Mennonite Church USA. And it's important to note that the membership guidelines, which were passed in 2001, were actually first proposed in St. Louis, Missouri in July of 1999 at a joint convention of the Mennonite Church, General Conference Mennonite Church, and Conference of Mennonites in Canada, where the delegates approved transforming the 3 denominational conference structures into 2 country structures, Mennonite Church US and Mennonite Church Canada, within a new Mennonite Church denomination. The membership guidelines proposed by a special membership committee and by the joint general boards of the 3 denominations were approved at the time by the new Mennonite Church Canada, which did not have any congregations under discipline at that time. However, they were not approved by the delegates of the new Mennonite Church US, requiring further study and work until the next delegate session scheduled for Nashville, Tennessee in 2001. So at the 2001 Delegate Assembly, 3 resolutions, the Viquez resolution, a resolution on the death penalty, and resolution on Plan Colombia were passed, and so were the membership guidelines for the formation of Mennonite Church USA. So what were those 3? The Viquez resolution concerned US military activity on the Puerto Rican island of Viquez. MCUSA resolved to send letters to the US government expressing our desire to stand in solidarity with our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters and send letters of support to Mennonite churches in Puerto Rico. The delegates committed to praying for Puerto Rican Mennonites, writing notes of encouragement, supporting the work of Christian peacemaker teams as they witness there, and acknowledging that we are a part of the military complex abusing the people in Viquez because we pay taxes that support the military. This resolution was approved without dissent. A resolution on the death penalty generated the most debate as some delegates wished a strong parallel resolution on abortion. The Resolutions Committee refused to include language on abortion, citing earlier statements by the Mennonite Church in 1975 and the General Conference Mennonite Church in 1980. In this resolution, Mennonite Church USA resolved to appeal to state and federal governments to abolish the death penalty, have the executive director of MCUSA address the issue with the President of the United States, and urge area conferences to address relevant governors, urge congregations to take action to support abolition of the death penalty through prayer, letter writing, and public vigils at murder sites and at prisons where executions occurred. And the resolution on Plan Colombia passed without dissent, and it was a letter to the US government expressing our deep concern regarding the violence caused by Plan Colombia. The Mennonite Church Canada Delegate Assembly that met a week later also passed a related resolution on Colombia, partially addressed to the Canadian government. In 2003, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Atlanta, Georgia, where one resolution, the resolution on healthcare, and two statements, statement on abortion and statement on immigration, were passed. It's important to note here that the resolution on healthcare of 2003 authorized the Healthcare Access Initiative, which, working on behalf of the Executive Board, the Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics formed the Healthcare Access Commission to carry out that initiative. And this initiative spanned 3 additional delegate assemblies. The statement on immigration affirmed individuals and churches working against poverty and fear in immigrant communities, church support for agencies working to address international inequality, and those speaking out about the unjust immigration policy, and that churches' anti-racism work, with an acknowledgement that more work needed to happen. In addition, MCUSA congregations were strongly urged to consider a variety of actions which would seek to build relationships with newcomers, partner with immigrant congregations, engage in mutual aid and advocacy, and deepen understanding through learning tours and engagement with national immigration rights organizations. In 2005, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the Delegate Assembly passed the Healthcare Access Initiative and a statement on the war in Iraq. The Healthcare Initiative extended the project to the San Jose Delegate Assembly of 2007, and the statement on the war in Iraq began by acknowledging our belief that peace is the will of God and seeking to remind our governmental leaders that the way of Christ is to move toward justice, peace, and compassion for all. In 2007, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in San Jose, California, where they passed membership in Christian churches together, support for bill to apologize Native Americans, and MCUSA Healthcare Access Summary. There, it was affirmed that MCUSA joined Christian Churches Together, which is a fellowship of Christian churches throughout the US, whose mission is to enable churches and national Christian organizations to grow closer together in Christ in order to strengthen our Christian witness in the world. The bill to apologize to Native Americans was in regard to a resolution pending before Congress, which would acknowledge a long history of official depredations and ill-conceived policies by the US government regarding Indian tribes and offer an apology to all Native peoples on behalf of the US. And in regards to the MCUSA Healthcare Access Summary, delegates overwhelmingly passed that they affirmed the work of the healthcare access since the 2005 Delegate Assembly, and that as a denomination, we are committed in principle to providing basic health insurance for all eligible pastors, and that the Executive Board oversee the development and implementation of a plan that would cover all MCUSA pastors with basic health insurance. In 2009, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Columbus, Ohio, where they passed 2 resolutions, resolution on healthcare access, a next step, and a resolution on following Christ and growing together as communities even in conflict, and one statement, a statement against human trafficking, modern day slavery. The statement against human trafficking, modern day slavery committed to 1, advocating for laws that protect victims and hold offenders accountable, and 2, taking personal responsibility as consumers to care for and seek healing for those who have been enslaved. A resolution on following Christ and growing together as communities, even in conflict, acknowledged the pain and frustration many experienced, confessed that our church has rarely found a way to create healthy, safe environments in which to have dialogues that build up the body of Christ, and respectful and honest about our differences, and affirmed the church's commitment to ongoing dialogue and discernment, agreeing to disagree in love, and MCUSA's vision statement of God's healing and hope flowing through us to the world. In 2013, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Phoenix, Arizona, where they passed Protecting and Nurturing Our Children and Youth and Creation Care Resolution for MCUSA. Protecting and Nurturing Our Children and Youth resolved that MCUSA would work proactively with its member congregations, conferences, and affiliated organizations to promote the protection of children and youth from all forms of abuse and neglect, and to advocate for their safety. And the Creation Care Resolution for MCUSA resolved that members of Mennonite Church USA would commit to growing in their dedication to care for God's creation as an essential part of the good news of Jesus Christ, explore the theological concepts and biblical resources that inform our commitment to creation care, and discern together how the Bible, our theological understandings, and the realities of the 21st century continue to shape and guide our relationship with creation. It was also resolved that there would be a 2-year study and discernment of responses to questions which were distributed in regard to the Creation Care Resolution. In 2014, there was a revision to the 2003 Statement on Immigration. Amongst other things, this statement renounced the indifference to and the mistreatment of people with and without documentation. It also committed to growing our cross-cultural competency, understanding the root causes of immigration and US immigration system, and called on congregations to engage in at least one educational action and one ministry action between 2014 and 2016. Suggestions regarding the educational and ministerial actions were provided in the statement. In 2015, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Columbus, Ohio, where they passed 4 resolutions and 2 statements. The resolution on faithful witness amid endless war. This resolution called for an immediate ban on research, development, production, and deployment of robotic and autonomous weapons, including military drones and associated artificial intelligence technologies, placing them in the same category as chemical and biological weapons, and specifically called on MCUSA to seek and implement forms of public ecumenical witness. The resolution on forbearance in the midst of differences recognized that amidst congregational differences on issues related to human sexuality, many congregations wish to remain in community with one another, allowed for confession of our mishandling of this conflict. It affirmed ongoing ethical boundaries, named the centrality of Jesus Christ and Scripture to our collective discernment, and acknowledged that we do not have consensus on matters related to the same-sex covenanted relationships, and affirmed terms for moving ahead together. The resolution on the status of the membership guidelines resolved that the membership guidelines adopted by the delegates in 2001 and updated in 2013 would continue to serve Mennonite Church USA as the guiding document for questions regarding church membership in same-sex relationships and marriages, alongside the confession of faith in a Mennonite perspective, that the delegate assembly would not entertain changes to the membership guidelines for the next 4 years, and that area conferences should interpret and implement these documents in mutual accountability with other area conferences, particularly through the CLC. In addition, it noted, quote, it would presume area conferences would grant ministerial credentials consistent with the guidelines in a shared understanding of church leadership as seems best in their context, unquote. It additionally called on the CSC to take seriously its role as the elders of the denomination, noting that the CLC discerned and advised the executive board, the delegate assembly, and MCUSA. The resolution, expressions of lament and hope, were also an acknowledgement of the horrific fatal shooting of the 9 parishioners at Emmanuel AME, MCUSA resolved to pray for the victim's family, build awareness, direct energy and resources to continued anti-racism education. A statement of support for our Palestinian and Israeli partners in peacemaking, committed to praying and acting for peace, in addition to understanding more fully the social, economic, and political contexts of where we live, work, and pray, reflecting on our theological and political understandings of Israel-Palestine and discerning ways we could seek a more just future for all peoples of Israel and Palestine. And the churchwide statement on sexual abuse confessed the ways in which our churches have failed to focus on teaching healthy sexuality and supporting survivors. It also resolved to tell the truth about sexual abuse, hold abusers accountable, and listen to survivors and those whom have been harmed. In 2017, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Orlando, Florida, where they passed Seeking Peace in Israel and Palestine. Resolution commitments included partnering with Palestinian and Israeli peacemakers, understanding the realities of occupation through study and learning trips, engaging Christian Zionism by encouraging them to enter into relationships with our Palestinian Christian partners. Other commitments included advocating with the US government to end military aid and arms sales in the region, to avoid economic support for occupation and instead invest in peace and justice, strengthen relationships with Muslims and Palestinian American communities, and examine the legacy of anti-Semitism and build relationships with Jewish communities. In 2019, the MCUSA Delegate Assembly met in Kansas City, Missouri, where they passed the churchwide statement on the abuse of child migrants. This statement condemned the abuse of migrants and called for a change in policy and action by the US government. In addition, this statement reaffirmed the 2003 resolution to, quote, advocate for just and humane policies for immigrants and refugees by contacting local, state, and national elected officials. It encouraged congregations to send members to the border regions for the MCC borderland trips and supported the work of MCC and other organizations that seek to meet the basic needs of incoming migrants. So now that we have listened to and developed a shared historic understanding of the resolutions which have passed, it's also important to understand the binding nature of these resolutions, how we ended up with a special delegate session, and what it can look like to think together in community, discuss, and imagine where we are headed. So John, I know you love history. Can you help us understand the binding nature of the resolutions and also how we ended up with a special delegate session?
Yeah, thanks, Bonita. Really thorough.
John, if I could interrupt you, because Bonita did a wonderful job. She's our new expert on the resolutions in Mennonite Church USA. I've just anointed her that way. But please, delegates, really good information that Bonita provided. Make sure you share this with other delegates, people in your circle, so they have a history of where we've come from. I think it's really important. Bonita did a wonderful job summarizing those things. So I would just encourage you all to share that. And I just want to stop there. Make sure that if you have questions for us, go ahead and put those in the question and answer section. We do want to give you some time to ask some questions, and we want to be able to respond to you. John, now I'll let you proceed with the rest of this.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And I second that nomination of Bonita as our recent resolutions resident expert. We'll stick with that. She's doing some solid work there. So thank you for that. So yeah, the question is, how do these function within our system, and are they binding, or what sort of teeth are behind these resolutions? And as I heard Bonita reflecting and reading some of the language of them, I was struck by how frequently these resolutions themselves use invitational language, or the language of persuasion, not the language of coercion. So individual members of congregations are called, or they are invited, or they are encouraged to do X, Y, and Z. And congregations are called or invited or encouraged to do, and conferences are called, invited, and encouraged. And that's the way that resolutions function within our system. The current guidelines for developing resolutions for MCUSA are really clear about this point. Resolutions are not binding Resolutions are not binding on conferences and congregations of Mennonite Church USA unless identified as having that intent from the beginning of the process. So if you think about these resolutions that Bonita listed through for us, think about them in your own congregational context. Which of these resolutions has played a role in your own congregation area conference? My sense is that the role that they have played, to the extent they have played any role at all, is because people have taken up that invitation. They've responded to that persuasion. Not that there's coercion there, but there's persuasion, there's invitation, there's an opportunity to act or respond in a certain way. And many of our congregations and members of our congregations do just that. Where resolutions are in fact binding within our system is because we believe that the delegate assembly, as representatives of the congregations, is the location of authority within the church where we do our best discernment, where we most clearly discern the voice of God. We believe that the assembly is the highest authority within the human church. And so the decisions that delegates make are binding on very specific groups of people, namely the executive board and the executive board staff. So executive board members are accountable to these resolutions that delegates pass, and executive board staff are accountable to these resolutions that delegates pass. So they're not binding on congregations or conferences, but they can be binding on the executive board and on executive board staff, particularly when it comes to setting denominational priorities and thinking about resource allocation within the denomination. The fact that these are not binding does not mean that they are irrelevant. So if you are a credentialed leader within Mennonite Church USA, if you are a pastor or a chaplain who holds credentials, or you're a conference minister, there's a good chance that your health care that you carry, the health insurance that you carry, derives directly from this lengthy resolutions process to move forward on developing a healthcare program, a health insurance program managed by Mennonite Church USA and available to credentialed leaders within Mennonite Church USA. And you heard that that was addressed at multiple delegate assemblies. It wasn't a once and done process. It took, if I understood Bonita correctly, there were 3 different delegate assemblies that took up some variation of this question. And even with all of that work done by delegates, paired with all of the work going on with committees and with staff, it's still not a perfect system. There are still questions of justice sort of embedded in that. What does it mean for a pastor to have access to healthcare that maybe their congregants don't have access to? How do we feel about that? And so it's not that there's unanimity about this, and it's not that it's a perfect solution, but it's an area where we had, to use this word that Glenn might ask me to define again, we had consensus. We had consensus that this is something we wanted to prioritize as a denomination. And it became binding, again, not on every congregation. Congregations can choose to participate or not, but it's binding at the level of executive board and executive board staff. I think about the immigration resolution when I think about this question of resolutions being binding or not. So I came into the congregation where I'm currently serving in 2014. So shortly after this resolution had been passed, and this had been the focus of conversation for much of the delegate assembly in 2013. And again, there's nothing binding. There's no command issued to a congregation that says you must do this, but there is an invitation there. And so this congregation where I'm currently serving, we tried to take that invitation seriously. We structured a series of educational workshops, part of what we call a winter Bible school, to look at questions of migration and immigration through a biblical lens. And we used a mixture of resources that had been developed by the denomination, including some of the talks given by Dr. Denny Carroll during the Phoenix Assembly. We shared some of those with the congregation. We brought in resource people from Mennonite Central Committee, and we had congregational conversation. And what emerged out of that, honestly surprising to me a little bit, it wasn't just an educational experience, but there were people in the congregation who said, we want to do something, we want to take action. And where we're located, one of the ready opportunities in front of us was to work in the refugee resettlement system alongside a partner agency, Church World Service. And so as a result of this work done by delegates in 2013, carried on by denominational staff in 2014, our local congregation entered into a wonderfully rich and rewarding and actually ongoing relationship with a family that was forced to flee their home in Syria and ended up resettling here in Lancaster County. So it's not because the resolution commanded us to do it. It wasn't binding, but it was an invitation that we took seriously and responded to. So I'm really thankful for the work that we do with solutions, even though they don't always dictate exactly what a congregation must do. So I'm going to pause there for a second about the binding nature of the resolution. Were there any questions that came in, Glenn, or any questions that you would want to ask there?
Still questions, but I do think that you really pointed out something really clear about this process. Most of them are invitational. They give us time as congregants and conference members to discuss these issues. So whether you agree or disagree, I think it does provide some clarity about who we are and what these things mean in our context. Now, um, what we do have is it does direct the work of the executive board staff. So me and my staff, we are accountable to these resolutions that come forward. We've had some resolutions that have had impact. Of course, we have the Corinthian plan. We've formalized some policies in regards to pastoral misconduct and sexual abuse. These things all come out of the delegate discussions in that process.
Mhm.
I do have a question that says, what were resolutions like before the conferences joined? I'm not sure I really understand that question, but it does give me an opportunity to clarify something. Members of Mennonite Church USA are the area conferences. So area conferences join Mennonite Church USA. Congregations join conferences and derive their membership in the denomination through the area conference. And so that's one reason, if you're familiar with our bylaws, that there's a limit to how binding resolutions can be, because that's how our bylaws are written. Conferences and congregations have the ability to govern themselves in our system. And so, again, delegates can really instruct the executive board, they can instruct the staff, they can instruct the program agencies to an extent, but individual congregational policies, we are part of a voluntary fellowship.
Mhm. Yeah, and I might be able to speak to this specific question. I think it's was talking a little bit about the merger. So how was
Okay.
the resolutions process different back when it was General Conference and Mennonite Church, and then also the Canadian group? I did not live through that history. I wasn't really part of the Mennonite Church when all this was unfolding. So some of you on this webinar probably lived this history and know it better than I do. But from what I've been able to gather, the resolutions processes were very similar to what we do now. There's a lot of tradition built into this. So you even have times where particularly General Conference and Old Mennonite Church passed very similarly worded statements, each of their delegate bodies, although they did it separately. It was clear there was some collaboration happening. So that happened with the formation of a joint confession of faith. It also happened with the what are called the Saskatoon and Purdue statements of 1986 and 87 pertaining to human sexuality. So there were times that the two groups were collaborating. I'm less familiar with the Canadian story there. One key difference was the structure or sort of polity of who would come together to make these decisions about resolutions. So in the old Mennonite Church, and I only actually learned of this very recently, I was kind of caught off guard by it. I find it fascinating. Area conferences would appoint delegates who would come together to discern resolutions and make decisions. In General Conference, it was congregations who would appoint delegates. So there was a difference in polity there, the role of the conference and the congregation. But outside of that difference, the process of developing resolutions, I think, was fairly similar in both groups and somewhat similar to what we're doing today.
We did have one question about what is the status of churches, I'm going to say congregations, that have left the conference. According to our bylaws, they are not members of Mennonite Church USA. That's just a fact of the technical legal aspect of it. This is a subject of much debate. I don't want to get too far into it, but really area conferences are members of Mennonite Church USA, and then congregations derive their membership based on being connected to one of our area conferences.
Mhm.
All right. Well, did you want to talk a little bit about the special delegate assembly, how we got there? And someone asked, "Hey, if it's so important, why are we having a special session?" So maybe you can speak a little about that, John.
Yeah. So one thing you may have picked up on when you were hearing Bonita highlight some of the work that we've done as a denomination over the past 2 decades is there have been some years where the resolutions process at the delegate assembly has gone very differently. So the first time I served as a delegate to an assembly was in 2011 in Pittsburgh. Maybe some of you were there. And the main action that delegates took was to take action to say they would not take any further action. It was called the Pittsburgh Experiment. It was proposed by leadership, sort of a test to say, are there other ways that we could spend our time together rather than debating and passing or not passing resolutions? And it was a reflection of a time of increasing polarization within the church, increasing disagreements within the church. And so in 2011, there was a deviation away from the sort of traditional resolutions process. Something similar, although not quite as dramatic, happened in 2013. The state of Arizona passed what at the time was the nation's most draconian anti-immigrant law on the books in any state in the country. And Mennonite Church USA was scheduled to have an assembly there. And so in response, there were calls to cancel or to move the assembly. What ended up happening was the bulk of the time of that assembly was focused around questions of immigration and migration. And so there were still some resolutions passed, but it wasn't the bulk of the time that delegates spent together. In 2015, if you look on the website, maybe some of you have memories of the assembly in 2015. Maybe some of you have some very unpleasant memories of that assembly. We passed a whole slew of resolutions, some of which were in direct tension with each other. And then in 2017, we had an abbreviated resolutions process because we had what we call the Future Church Summit, a time to try to bring more voices to the table, to hear from more diverse parts of our collective body where we think God might be leading us as churches. Along the way, there were some commitments made to various Mennonite Church USA. There were both commitments made that we will do certain things, particularly look at the membership guidelines, and commitments made that we would not do certain things, particularly look at the membership guidelines. In 2015, there was a resolution that said we would not revisit the question of the membership guidelines for 4 years. So there's a resolution passed in 2015 that said we won't take this up again until 2019. So I think the sense of among many within the church that would come up on the agenda in 2019. Leading up to the delegate assembly in 2019, we had some significant and critical staff turnover. Irvin Stutzman, our previous executive director, retired, and Glen Guyton stepped into that. There were some other staff turnover pieces. And so the consensus of the executive board at the time was to say, we aren't ready to take on a conversation of this magnitude, having just gone through these leadership transitions. We need to take 2 more years of discernment and prayer and process. And so there were some processes started in 2019 to look at the membership guidelines. There was a special advisory group formed that came out with some recommendations. And the expectation was that there would be action taken at the delegate assembly planned for Cincinnati, Ohio in 2021. So that was moving forward. The executive board met in January of 2020. There was a good plan, what I felt was a good plan emerging, coming together, and then all of our lives were upended by the global COVID-19 pandemic. And so, there are very long lead times on something like a delegate assembly where you bring hundreds or thousands of folks into the same place. There are a lot of logistics, a lot of contracts that have to be executed with vendors and suppliers and locations and venues. And so in light of sort of those long lead times, the executive board made a decision to not plan for a delegate assembly in 2021. There was just too much uncertainty. Would we be able to safely meet? Would people be comfortable gathering together? Paired with that sense that this is not the right time for us to meet in person was an equally strong conviction that this work is important enough and we value face-to-face discernment enough that we didn't want to attempt to try to make decisions about significant issues within the life of the church via the format that we're connecting by right now. Zoom is great for a lot of things and has really made ministry possible in ways that would be really difficult to imagine without technologies like this. Not great for communal discernment. You and I are not talking right now. I'm talking, and I wish I could be hearing more from you, but it would be really hard for us to have an honest exchange of views, especially across several hundred delegates in this sort of a platform. So while the decision was made to not meet in person in 2021, there was plans made for a special delegate assembly, noting that there had been a commitment to address these questions in 2019, or at least the end of a moratorium on addressing these questions in 2019 that was already postponed 2 years. And the sense was it would not feel appropriate or healthy in the life of our church to postpone it an additional 2 years. I should also note that the membership guidelines, when they were first voted in, were scheduled to be reviewed in 2007, and that review, at least formally, did not actually take place. So there's been a long process of delay around these questions. And the sense of the executive board was that this is worth being together in person. It's worth having an honest exchange of views. And so plans were made for a special delegate assembly. When those plans were made, we were not anticipating this current surge of COVID that perhaps we've just passed the peak of, although no one's entirely sure, I don't think. So there are still ongoing conversations about all that, but our expectation is that we will be able to meet in person, and that this is significant enough within the life of our church that it's worth investing our time to come together and have these important conversations.
So John, you're anticipating some of the questions that just came in.
Yeah, I'm not quite good at this enough to talk and read at the same time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it's a couple of questions. One is, are demographics or identifying information made public related to the voter groups or individual voters? No, we don't do that. I mean, it's a public vote. So if you're at the delegate assembly, you can scan the room, but we don't capture demographic information. And remember, these are representatives of other constituencies. They aren't just voting as individuals. So you could capture demographic information, but I don't, it wouldn't be accurate. It wouldn't be accurate in some sense of what you're trying to capture, possibly. So that's just something to be mindful of. Is it possible that the May meeting will be canceled? Yes, it is possible. It's January. No one predicted the global pandemic, and I don't know what's going to happen in May. So yes, it is possible. We will continue to do our due diligence and watch the news and listen to the experts like anyone else. The trend is that we could have it if the trends continue the way they have over the past couple of years, but we don't know. And then someone asked about the names of authors. No, that isn't secret information. It's something I would need to talk to the resolutions committee about, how we display that information. We don't want people personally attacked, because of these things. Normally, these resolutions are written by groups, and so churches are identified. The authors will be present during these webinars. You'll see people that have written these things, but we will work on that. The inclusive pastors were the authors of the Repentance and Transformation resolution. They even have a whole website dedicated to that resolution. So the process isn't secretive. We talk about these things at the executive board meeting, at the CLC. The authors themselves are encouraged to blog about the resolutions, to talk about the resolutions. So we try to be as transparent as possible. I'm not sure why the names aren't in the current iteration that's on the website, but that's something we'll talk about offline.
Yeah, and one of the things the resolutions committee is also exploring, we don't have a particularly standardized form or sort of structure for people to submit resolutions. So you see a wide variety of things. Some are structured sort of using legislative language, whereas, be it resolved. Others are just long paragraphs or sort of lists of pearls. Some just grab the MCUSA logo and throw it on to make it look official even before it's been voted on. So that's one thing we'll continue having conversation about. I also saw a question. Do we think that this special assembly will gather the majority of the congregations to be able to discern widely? Sister Sandra, I hope you don't mind me saying that you said that question. I'm so glad you're on this webinar. Always good to hear from you. This is a persistent challenge, not just with special delegate assemblies, but with all delegate assemblies. And I think it's something we've become increasingly attuned to, although it's certainly a question people have been wrestling with for a while. It's a lot of work to get a delegate or delegates from a congregation to an assembly. And there are questions about privilege, access, wealth, congregations that can afford it, having people in the congregation who can take paid time off or afford to take unpaid time off or are retired. So there are questions of sort of equity, justice, access. I think the denomination did a lot of wrestling with that in 2013 with having an assembly in Arizona. And I've been seeing sort of creative ideas popping up here and there. What if we use technology better? What if we relied on regions better? I think there are a lot of good ideas out there. I think all of those ideas take time to think through and discern and imagine how we might embrace them. So I think it's a fair question to be asking, how representative will this be? I think the one thing all of us can do is make whatever efforts we can within our own circles to encourage people to attend. There are going to be some financial resources available from the denomination. There's some area conferences that are making resources available. So, if you're someone who wants to participate, or if you're aware of people in congregations who want to participate, but there are barriers, reach out to Glenn or someone on his staff, someone on his executive board, and let's think creatively about how we can reduce the barriers to access and get as many people participating as we can.
We have some answers to that on the frequently asked questions on the delegate resource page. So check that out. We have in 2017, we had over 600 congregations in Mennonite Church USA. This is before the pandemic. We only had a little over 500 delegates. If the delegate assembly was truly representative of all of the people that could attend, we should have closer to 6,000 delegates at the delegate assembly with a denomination of 60,000 members. And so we have not had that number of people attend the delegate assembly ever. But that's what the number should be, closer to 6,000. So we know it's not a perfect system. And we also are aware of, we talked a little bit about the binding nature of these resolutions and things like that. Again, this is more of an invitational process. It's not creating a law for everyone to fall in line. That's not how we operate as a denomination. But it is important that we hear various voices. Another person asked, "Hey, when are you going to let us know?" Don't buy your plane tickets yet. Just hold on. You have time. Again, please be patient with us. It's January. No one knows. Dr. Fauci doesn't even know what's going on with this pandemic. President Biden, President Trump, no one has gotten it perfectly right. And so here in my office, my staff and I, we're going to do the best we can, but we don't want you to come if you don't feel safe. We want to have the best process possible. And if we need to cancel it, we will. You have time. I wouldn't rush out and buy plane tickets, but the process that you're going through now, you're going to have to go through it at some point. So either you're going to have extra time to discern these matters, or you'll have the time that we've already allotted. So these conversations are important. The work that we're doing now is important. Whether or not we can meet in May, I'm not saying we're going to cancel it. Don't hear me saying that. I'm just saying that this preparation time is still important. And we're going to let you know if we need to make changes as soon as we can. We will definitely do that. Well, I don't know. Well, Bonita, we had a few other questions. I don't know if you wanted to tackle those in our last couple of minutes.
I'd love to. So thank you everyone who responded to survey questions that we provided. We got a lot of good information here. Some of the questions that we wanted to address, we've already addressed. John, Glenn, thank you so much for talking about the binding nature. That was one of the questions. Actually, bear with me just a moment as I'm pulling up some of those responses that we got. So other questions that we also received were, if resolutions are so important, why are we holding a special session instead of waiting? John addressed that one. Typically, weighty resolutions are presented first as study resolutions. This time that process was upended. Some people noted that this feels troubling. Here's a good question for you, John. Do you know when the resolutions started to play a part in church polity?
Oh, in polity? Whoa, that's a great question. I mean, I would say it's with Schleitheim, right? There's this confession that people agree to or not. And then, yeah, I think it really intensifies in the 1900s. I'm sure there's obviously a lot that happens between those two events, but the frequency of resolutions increases, and it becomes more about actually addressing specific questions and not making these slightly broader statements of faith or confessions. So it's about dress, it's about recreation, it's about militarism, and I think that really intensifies in the 1900s.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. Camille, I don't know if we have this document. I know you all can't see this really. It's this document that I think Iris came up with. It shows you all of the Anabaptist statements and confessions and kind of the cycle that we went through. Maybe we need to put this on our delegate resource page. I know you really couldn't see that. but we have a tendency to live in the moment. But these things take time, and I'm so thankful for Bonita and John giving us a little history to keep these things in perspective. I mean, the church is going to be okay. We go through these changes. We respond to the culture. We respond to the move of God. And so we have to be mindful of that. If you follow the lectionary, I think we're focusing on John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42, the Samaritan woman. And Jesus talks about, the Samaritans. One group wants to worship on the mountain. One group wants to worship in Jerusalem. But Jesus says, hey, there's going to come a time when we have to make some changes. We're going to worship God in spirit and in truth. It doesn't matter if you're on the mountain or if you're in Jerusalem. So things change, right? Maybe I'm not a theologian, but things change. And I think even Jesus responded to those cultural changes as he spoke and ministered to people. Would you agree with that, Pastor John?
I would, and I feel bad, you're quoting scripture and starting to preach, and so I feel bad even using this word now. But what I forgot to say in response to the question Bonita raised is resolutions also correlate with the rise of institutionalization.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Where the church goes from being primarily almost an extended family system to being institutionalized. And once you're an institution, you have to have decision-making methods. And because as Mennonites were skittish about the consolidation of power, we don't hire someone like Glen and give him a pope hat and say, you make all the decisions. We say, we want to be sure that you make the decisions we want you to make. I actually read one history of the Baptist tradition, which has some similarities in polity, that said the primary job of church leaders is to hold the church, is to make sure they don't ever accrue enough power to actually do their job. And so that's sort of in some ways where part of the role of resolutions is, because we are an institution and we have built institutions as Mennonites, we have to make decisions. And so we have this method of making decisions that brings hopefully as many people together as possible.
When you're talking about the method of decision-making, John, brings up one of the other questions we received when people were going ahead and applying. This one said, before a resolution needs to come to the discernment process, will that be covered as well? So before resolution needs to come the discernment process.
Yeah, so there is a process spelled out, the guidelines for developing resolutions.
Which I think was dropped in the chat earlier.
Scroll up, you should be able to see that there. So there's a multi-step process. There is a resolutions committee that both currently serving on in preparation for the 2023 Delegate Assembly. The resolutions window for the Delegate Assembly is passed at this point. So resolutions can be submitted to that committee. You can also submit them directly to executive board staff, who will pass it along to the committee. And they're, anyone can submit a resolution, but the goal is that they would have some sense of broad support already before coming to that level. So it's great to get multiple congregations involved, or ideally multiple area conferences together, engaged, talking together about these questions. And then those resolutions come to the resolutions committee, which engages in a process with the authors of those resolutions. They often go to the Constituency Leaders Council for further review and evaluation. There's a little bit of ambiguity within our structure about exactly what role CLC has. Executive Board also has a chance to review them. So there is a multi-step process before they come to delegates. But the hope is that all along the way, there's really active conversation and engagement happening. And that, I think, is part of what's great about our resolutions process, even though it can be frustrating at times, is it drives conversation. And I think that conversation is where we often encounter God, as we meet people who have differing perspectives from us and we learn together. And so there is that long process leading up to it.
That's great. I think we're it's about time for us to wrap up. We will have a recording of this. One last question. Someone asked, hey, have you considered moving the meeting later? Yes, we have, but Mennonite World Conference is actually scheduled to occur. They're still trying to decide if they're going to have their assembly. So there are multiple organizations that we partner with that have other things on the calendar. We try to pick the time with the least conflict. Again, we'll let you all know when we know if we need to make any changes. Right now, we're planning to have the special session of the Delegate Assembly in May. Hope to see you there if you feel safe and comfortable, and if things start to get better as far as the healthcare system and this virus. But thank you all so much. Make sure you check out the Delegate Assembly resource page. Share this recording with other people. Thank you all for participating. This is what we want. We want people to prepare and be ready for the Delegate Assembly when it happens. So thank you all so much for your time. Hope you all have a wonderful evening wherever you are. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bonita.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Take care.